Okay, let's talk a little bit about what got us thus far. We're not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, obviously, but we do want to talk about what happened just recently in our studies since we skipped Wednesday night due to our singing night. But who's the main character of our study right now?
Joseph.
Joseph, okay. And Joseph was the son of who?
Jacob.
Jacob, yeah. And Jacob had how many sons total?
12.
Okay. How many daughters that we know of? One. What was her name? Dinah. Okay. All right, and so Jacob was what descendant of Abraham?
He was grandson.
Grandson of Abraham. Okay, and his father's name was?
Isaac.
Isaac. That's right. And he had a twin brother named
Esau.
Okay. All right, so as Jacob came to the age of about 17, his father sent him out to check on his brethren. And they were keeping the herds in the field, the pastures. And where were they living at that particular time?
Canaan.
Okay, specifically. Hebron, that's right. Hebron, Mamre, the oaks of Mamre, all of that considered later on to be Hebron or Hebron. And so Jacob said, "Go up to what town and check on my sons." Shechem, that's right. So he went up to Shechem. He was looking around, trying to find his brethren, where the flocks were, and in an area the size of Shechem, would that have been relatively hard or relatively easy, or what would have been? What do you think about that? If it's you and you're going up there to Shechem to try to find Jacob's sons, I'm sorry?
One helicopter.
A helicopter.
Yeah, because it's pretty mountainous.
Yeah, okay. Well, Jacob didn't have a helicopter, did he? No, or probably, had there been such a thing, probably been wealthy enough to afford one because he was a very wealthy man. But so Joseph went up there and he was looking around, and what happens? Remember?
Oh, he was directed to go to Canaan.
Sees a man that tells him.
Okay, yeah, there's a man that finally said, "Who are you looking for?" He says, "I'm looking for Jacob's sons." And he says, "Oh, they're going to so-and-so." How would this man have known Jacob's sons? Okay, he was a wealthy man. Jacob was a wealthy man. They had a huge flock. And so that's the reason they weren't in Shechem, because the flock had already, fed off the pasture land in that area, however long they were there. And so he said they're going up to Dothan, right. Dothan. So Dothan was just north of Shechem. And so what occurred when they were in Dothan? First of all, what did the brothers say, Albie, when they saw Joseph coming? What did they say?
There's the dreamer.
All right, here comes this dreamer. Right. And so after that, they made a plan. And their initial plan was to do what with him? Kill him. That's right. They wanted to kill him. They had hatred for him so badly. It started out with the multicolored coat, and then with the dreams that he had, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And all of that situation there. And so Reuben wanted to protect. And who was Reuben?
He was the eldest.
All right, the oldest son, Reuben. And so he wanted to protect Joseph. And so, Billy, what was Reuben's idea?
Reuben was to get and come back later and get him out and
Okay.
quote unquote protect him.
Okay, all right. So that's what the plan was. Well, meanwhile, Reuben's off tending to the flock or something, carrying on some kind of business, and lo and behold, here comes Ishmaelite traders, and Judah looks up and he says, "Let's do this. Sell him, yeah. Let's sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother. We don't want to kill him, and so let's just sell him. And so, which is, kind of ironic. And so here come the Ishmaelite traders, and the Midianites get involved in the brokerage of the deal. They pull him out of the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites. Egypt. All right, so there's a note in our workbook. And let's see what page. Page 105. There under map assignment, he asks us to locate Dothan, which is north, south, east, or west of Hebron. North. Okay. North and maybe a little west, but more north than anything. And so that's where Dothan was. Shechem was about west, and then Dothan north of Shechem. All right, so he says there were trade routes that came from Mesopotamia through passes in Mount Carmel and converged with the way of the sea to go on to the land of Egypt. What was the way of the sea?
It was a trade route.
Okay, a trade route that went north and south in the land along the coastal plain near the Mediterranean. So caravans of merchants, therefore, often passed through the land as they plied their trade from one country to another. And obviously these brothers were feeding their sheep near enough to a trade route to see the caravan as it approached. So that's what happened. They flagged the caravan, sell Joseph into their hands for how much? 20 pieces of silver. Yes, Ken?
I'm wondering, did they do it for 20 because they knew they were going to sell them somewhere else and they might get 30? I don't know. Because 30 is the typical price for somebody put that in. And they've got inflation and all that.
Well, we've been carrying charges, as we sometimes say, but yes, they were wanting profit. And so they probably did say, well, we can only pay this much because when we take him to Egypt, he'll only bring this much. Although he was a fine, strapping, good-looking young man, according to the scriptures. And so they went on their way, and they sold him to Potiphar, and, Potiphar may have paid 50 for him, who knows? But that was the deal they struck, 20 pieces of silver. They went down and did indeed sell Joseph to Potiphar, and Potiphar used him as what? Sorry?
Oh, pretty much everything. I mean, over all of this.
It was over his household.
Okay, but previous to that, he worked in the house. He was a part of the servants of the household. And then he was promoted because of what reason?
Everything he touched profited.
Right, that's right. He did good work, and everything that he did profited. And so Potiphar saw that. He promoted him to second in command in his household. And this is going to be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A sign, I guess we could say, as to what's going to happen a little bit later. And so Potiphar promotes him, and the next thing we know, Joseph's in trouble with Potiphar. And how did that come about?
His wife, Potiphar's wife, made advances immorally toward Joseph and tried to force him to lie with her. He fled and got out, left his garment, and then she lied about him. And Potiphar, rather than investigating the story, believed her and threw him in prison.
Okay, all right, very good. And that's important what you say there about investigating the story. This is God's will that things happen that. But one point I want to make in regard to that is that when we hear something about a brother, sister, family member, friend, whoever, the common saying is, and it is true, there's always two sides to every story.
Right.
And while we don't choose sides, those two sides can be an indicator as to the truth of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so had Potiphar checked with Joseph and verified what he had to say with other members of the household, you know, this was an obvious thing with her, that they would have seen some indication that she was after Joseph, because the day that she snatched his coat and he left out was the only day there was no one else in the house with him. So that would have been an obvious thing. There would have been others that would have witnessed that. And so the point I want to make is this, and I understand it's God's will that it occurred like it did, but as far as we're concerned today, if we hear something from someone, we want to verify that. Okay? We want to make sure that we're getting the truth of the matter if it's something that is actionable upon our part. And that's specifically having to do with members of the congregation or family or friends or whatever. Let's make sure we do the proper things that are none of our business.
Right.
We're not to investigate those, but we are to investigate those things that require action on our part. Yes, Murphy?
Jeremy, if we don't investigate and then we start talking about it, we're participating in rumors and gossip, and the Bible condemns that very harshly in Old and New Testament.
That's right. Okay. All right, so Joseph is thrown into prison, and there he meets two individuals, and what are their identities?
Butler and Baker.
Butler and Baker, and they weren't just a butler and just a baker. They were the chief butlers, a butler and baker of Pharaoh. So they were in the same prison. They were in Potiphar's prison where Joseph was, and they had dreams. Joseph interpreted those. Those came to fruition just as Joseph said. And so now the butler is restored to his position, and the baker has his head taken off. And so he dies. And so as a result of all those things, we find ourselves in a situation where the butler is now back in his office. He's asked by Joseph, "Remember me to Pharaoh," but the butler forgets. All right, so that brings us to today's, a lot of other things we can talk about, but that brings us to today's lesson, Pharaoh's dreams. So in Genesis chapter 41, we learn that Pharaoh has a dream, two dreams actually, and this occurs about 2 years after he restored the butler to his position, and he fell asleep one night and he dreamed a dream. What was the first dream he dreamed? About what?
Cattle.
Cattle, yeah, it's about the cattle, right? So 7 cattle, or as King James Version renders it, kine, K-I-N-E, came up out of the river. He's referring to the Nile there. Came up out of the Nile River. The first 7 were fine, goodly, fat cattle, probably ready for slaughter. Then following them, and they began to eat in the marshes there around the Nile, feed in the marshes. And then the other cattle, 7 other cattle came up out of the Mediterranean, gaunt, skinny, looking bad, looking like they hadn't eaten in 7 years. And so they consumed the fine, fat cattle. Pharaoh awakes, and this concerns him. He's wondering what this is supposed to mean. So after he considered that a little bit, he fell back asleep. And what did he dream about?
Heads of grain.
Okay, heads of grain or stalks of corn, whatever translation you have, however that renders that. On one stalk, 7 fat heads of grain or cobs of corn, whatever, ready for harvest. Opposite them, a stalk with 7 heads of grain that are in really pitiful shape, blasted by the wind, not ready for harvest, not ready for anything except silage maybe. And so, just like with the cattle, the pitiful looking heads of grain ate the others, the fine and goodly. So by this time, Pharaoh is really distressed about that. So what does he do to try to find the answer? Who does he first call, Bill?
All the magicians and the wizards.
Okay. All the magicians, the wizards, the wise men of Egypt, and they can't decipher what it means. They don't understand. And so the butler hears about it. Let me get to where we need to be. Okay. So the butler recalls that he was supposed to remember Joseph to Pharaoh. And he says, it's very interesting how he begins to tell this to Pharaoh. In verse 9, he says, then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. He was reminded of him being put back in his position, and it was as a result of Joseph telling him the dream, what the interpretation of it was. And he says in verse 10, Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. And we had a dream on the same night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came about that just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him, that is, the baker. And so Joseph was right about those outcomes, and so Pharaoh. And so he requests for Joseph to come see. So where is Joseph at this time? In the prison, yeah. As a matter of fact, it mentions the dungeon. He's in the dungeon of the prison, and the dungeon may have very well been the complete prison, but nonetheless, he was there, and that descriptive term tells us he was in a position and a place where he would not have been fit to just walk out and see Pharaoh because of the position that he was in, even though he was above the others in the prison. And so the prison keeper came and got Joseph, made sure that he was shaved and cleaned up, put good clothes on him, and they took him before Pharaoh. So he went before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, young man, I had these two dreams, and I don't understand what they mean. I've asked all the magicians and the wizards and the wise men of this great country of Egypt to come and tell me what they mean, and no one can tell me. I want you to tell me what they mean. What was Joseph's reply?
It is not in me to interpret the dream. God will give Pharaoh the answer.
Okay, that's right. God is the one that interprets the dream. Back when the butler and the baker, if you remember, had their dreams, what did Joseph say about when he heard that when he came in, he saw their countenance was sad. He said, what's wrong with you? And they have dreamed these dreams and we don't know what they mean. What did he say? Yeah, he said, interpretations belong to God. Tell me, and he will give you the answer. And so Joseph pulled out of the dungeon, cleaned up, and able to stand before Pharaoh, had the opportunity to say, oh yeah, Pharaoh, I know what I'm doing here. I can tell you that, but you've got to get me out of this prison. He didn't do that, did he? No. He was humble. He was obedient to God. He was faithful. And so he said, interpretation. And so Joseph began to interpret his dreams. Pharaoh rehearsed his dreams to Joseph, and then Joseph told Pharaoh, God is showing you what's to come to pass. The reason you had two dreams very similar, Pharaoh, is because this is a serious matter, and it's important, and it is indeed going to occur, and you need to know about it. There will be 7 years of plenteous harvest, represented by the 7 fat cows and the 7 ears of grain that were very healthy and ready for harvest. But behind that, there would come 7, represented by the gaunt and bad-looking cows and the ears of grain. So those 7 years of famine will come following that those 7 years of plenteous harvest. And again, he says this is the reason that you had 2 dreams. Yes, sir.
In my King James Bible, after all the things was the 2 dreams were told, the way the King James interprets it, he said the dream of Pharaoh is one. In other words, all of this fits together. We could liken it to the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle.
Right. Yeah. It's one message.
One message. That's the word.
And so, after give Pharaoh advice from God, Joseph just didn't come up with this on his own, just like he didn't interpret the dreams on his own. He came up with this advice for Pharaoh, and he said, so let Pharaoh look out from among the leaders of Egypt for a discreet and a wise man. Now, I think we know why wisdom would be needed, right? Because it takes a man that's got some wisdom to be able to organize this situation and know how much grain to give and that kind of thing. But what about the discretion part? Yes. Right, that's right. And so this was not something that every individual in Egypt would find out about. This was something that would be kept within the confines of this small government, and Pharaoh would know about it, and Joseph would know about it, and maybe some of the officers under Joseph, we don't know for sure, but you would have to have discretion, like Dustin said, lest panic ensue. And so he said, let that man set up overseers, and let him take in 1/5 of the harvest in the 7 years of plenty. Of that year's grain. And so they, over a period of time, over a period of 5 years, you would have as much as 1 year would produce, you would think, normally. And then you'd have 2 other years that you would have 2/5 more. But here's the thing about the 7 years of plenty. There had, as far as what I can tell from what the Bible tells us, there had never been a harvest like that before. And so God had blessed the land. He brought forth a very great harvest. And as a result of that, that 1/5 that they took of the harvest would have amounted to much more than that. So if you're trying to do the math and figure out, well, that's really probably the last 7 years of famine, don't think that way. Because God blessed Egypt even greater than rain or 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh spoke to his advisors about that. They agreed. And so now we're going to set out and try to find this man that is both wise and discreet and is capable of carrying all of this out. Who else would you pick than a man of God to do that? So here's Joseph. He's brought the plan. He brought the interpretation. And so Pharaoh, in his concern about this very serious situation, is wondering where he's going to find a man like this. And then God reveals to him, and he realizes that Joseph is not choice. If a man, yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I think it's, I don't know if it's important to note, but I think it's an interesting note that Joseph didn't recommend himself.
Right.
There's some humility there because you would think someone that has had these dreams and has interpreted other people's dreams and has been continually successful in whatever he's done, has been blessed by God, that if I was in Joseph's position, I find it hard to say, well, you can set me in charge. I can handle it with God's will. Right? That'd be something I'd be tempted to say. But Joseph, he said, you find someone that's discreet and wise and you set them in charge. He didn't suggest that it would be him. Ended up being him. He ended up being blessed by God. But I think there's an amazing example of humility that he didn't suggest himself right off.
It is, absolutely. Absolutely. That's the kind of thing that Haman would, Haman would, oh, I'm your man. I'm your man. I can do it. And so Joseph, as Jacob stated, was very humble and very obedient to God. So, in this case, the good man wins out. Yes, Ken.
It also strikes me every time I read it that Joseph says, well, it's not in me to do this, but God can reveal secrets. That always seems very dangerous to me. Well, I can't do it. But
He was just telling the truth, was
yeah, I mean, that's humility also.
right. That's right. Al,
I think it's interesting also. He's got the wisdom to discern. Here's a man that's telling the truth. He doesn't have anything politically to gain.
yeah, yeah.
That's a lot of power.
It does. And this would have been a guy that would have been completely different from those advisors and other wise men that he had surrounded
example for us that we always are guided by God's wisdom, and it's a sure sign that we're going to come out here. I just couldn't help but see that.
That's right, and that's what happened to Joseph, because he is appointed to the second in command for the second time, but this time he's over all of Egypt. And I can't help but think about Potiphar's wife at this point. And just think how she must be fuming, because she's, we know what kind of person she is. She's got to be fuming and mad because she had her satisfaction with Joseph being thrown into prison. And now he's taking command, and she can't even lift her foot without his knowledge or his saying that's okay. So we see how that God's will works out in those cases. So Joseph received Pharaoh's signet, fine clothing, a chariot, and honor. And so, like we would imagine in ancient places where when the king would come through, or a very important man would come through, there would be a runner in front of him. Here comes the great king Pharaoh. And so this runner would be going in front of just ruler of Egypt, Joseph, second in command only to Pharaoh, and all this big pomp and circumstance. But this is a fact, and we really don't think about that if we're just reading straight through the scriptures, but that's basically what it tells us without any elaboration, that he had those types of people to go before him and serve him, and all of that did not hinder his faith nor his humility in all his life. So it's very important for us to consider that. I mean, here's a man that has literally gone from rags to riches. And his way of life has not been hindered so far as his obedience to God is concerned. Right. So Pharaoh told Joseph that he was the ruler that all would have to look to for guidance. A lot of responsibility. Not only is it a great, but a lot of responsibility. And Joseph knows that he, with God's help, can do this. He can take care of it. No one would be able to so much as lift a foot without his permission and knowledge. And so he was the one that all of Egypt had to answer to. And so when these men who were selected under him to go out and actually do the work and provide for other servants to get the work done and gathering the grain, at time of harvest, and all that. And it was a very busy time in those years of plenty. All they had to do was say, the ruler Joseph sent him, and I can't make the name right offhand, and Pharaoh named him, but this man, I come in this man's authority, and so the landowner or the land worker, the servant, whatever, said, okay, here's your 1/5 of harvest. I'll help you load it. So that's the way things went. And so they took it and put it in the storehouses. See, did I skip? Here we go. Joseph organized his overseers. They gathered grain in every part of Egypt. God prospered Egypt in those 7 years so that the land would be able to provide not only for the Egyptians, but also the inhabitants of other countries who would come to buy grain. And so Joseph is greatly blessed. Now, while in Egypt, Joseph is given Asenath as wife. Interestingly enough, she is the daughter of the priest of On. The priest of On would have been a priest of an idol god. So this Asenath would have been raised in a heathen, worldly type of lifestyle. Yet Joseph was given her wife. And so I made this comment several studies ago, but we remember now when you get to the children of Israel, that is the 12 sons, we'll see them going back into Mesopotamia to get wives from Rebekah's family. They're getting their wives from the daughters of the land by now. And I think one of the reasons for that is that by this time, Rebekah's family had been corrupted as well, because we talked about Laban and the teraphim that he had in his household. And so there's some issue there. Israel, or Jacob, commanded all of his family to leave all of those things behind, and they did so. This was even before Benjamin was born. So he buried them there under the oak. And so they left all of those things behind that they had brought with them from Mesopotamia. So we say, well, why was it that God was so insistent about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob obtaining a wife from Haran, Mesopotamia, or Syria, really, area. And so, I don't know the answer to that other than the fact that God wanted to keep that first section of the family pure, and after that, they had to be faithful and stand on their own and teach their family, teach their wives to do what God would have them to do. And so that was Joseph's task. When he married Asenath, or even before, he had to teach her that we're going to follow Jehovah. We're not going to follow this idol that your fathers preached on. And that would have been a difficult thing, I'm sure. But she would have done that. So later on, she gave birth to Manasseh and then to Ephraim. Interestingly enough, this is one of the very few times that we hear the name of Joseph's wife. Rebecca was a big, Sarah was a big character. Rebecca was a big character in the early lives of those families. But now the women were not so much from the standpoint that they basically the world. And God was focused on the men and the sons from that point. So Manasseh and Ephraim later become men, and they later become what? Tribes, yeah. They're leaders of the tribes. What else was you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that they were adopted by
Right.
now it was kind of like 13 tribes, kind of.
By Jacob. Yeah, Jacob. Yes. Yes. Right. And they run together. And so that is true. He took Joseph's portion and gave it to Manasseh. He died. So God continued to bless Joseph greatly. The famine was very severe throughout all the world at that time, and Joseph provided for all through God's providence. So now we come to a very interesting and dramatic part of the Bible story. You know, I got thinking about this yesterday. We watch drama TV sometimes. How, it's kind of like we're sitting there in our chair, we're watching this show, and we're become part of it, and we're the detective, and we're trying to figure things out. Kind of thing, that kind of story came from stories like this. Joseph is the second in command in Egypt. His father So it brings us to Genesis chapter 42. Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt. And so as the famine began, Jacob got word that Egypt had grain. Word like that spreads among men that have large flocks that need that type of thing to carry their time, also to feed their family. So found out that, hey, there's a great storehouse of grain in Egypt. And it's quite interesting that Jacob says to his sons, I'll tell you what, why don't y'all tell me what he said? We found out they had grain. What does he say to his sons?
Why are you sitting here looking at each other?
Yeah. Yeah. Why are you standing around?
Yeah.
Get down to Egypt and get us some grain before we die. And so he sent all the brothers except Benjamin to Egypt. Why did he not send Benjamin? Really?
You won't lose him either.
Okay.
He was afraid something would happen to him.
That's what happened to him. And there's going to be a comment made here if we get to it a little bit later on that really shows Israel's desire for his youngest son to be spared. For after all, he and Joseph were what?
Was a son
Full brother.
special wife.
Yeah, full brother, son of Rachel. So it was important too. And so the trip is made, and Jacob's sons arrive in Egypt to buy grain. And the Bible tells us that Jacob was the one who sold the grain to all of the buyers, and saw he recognized his brothers. Came up to him and said, hey, where you at? All right, but before that, what does he do? Disguises himself. Yeah, he acts like he doesn't know them. And then what do the brothers do when they come before him? Bow down to him. Let's look at Genesis 37 and verse 7. Genesis 37 and verse 7, shortly after Jacob had received his coat colors, the brothers hated him so, and he said to them, verse 6, please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were at the field and rose up, and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheep. Then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Well, now, yes, the answer to their questions was yes, he would reign over them. And he was in a position parts of our land. Verse 9 of chapter 42 tells us that. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them, and said to them, you are to come to look at the undefeated parts of our land, undefeated parts of our land. But the brothers maintained their innocence. Oh no, we're innocent. We are sons of one man. They explained to Joseph that they were sons of this one man who lived in Canaan. He said, one son. So how many would be there? How many of the brothers would be standing before Joseph? 10. One son is still at home with our father, and one is not. And what he means is that it's not that he wasn't before his father, but it was that they thought he was dead, or said that he was dead. Okay.
I'll say, maybe it's a translation thing version doesn't say it, but I'm not seeing where it says Joseph disguised himself. I see where it says he made himself out to be a stranger. Maybe some versions, I guess, said disguised is coming from. But at the end of chapter 41, it says Joseph was third. And a few chapters back, Joseph had some dreams, it said he was 17. So it has been 13 years.
Yes.
So it seems to me between that and then between, I would assume, not only the aging but also the dress that he would have been in due to his position, that seems to be more of the reason they didn't recognize him than an actual intentional disguise.
That may be the other manuscript does indicate that he disguised himself. The New American Standard renders it that way in verse 7. But whether that's the case or not, I think all of them combined would indicate that. All right, Murphy and then Ken.
In my King James Version, verse 7, everybody and Joseph saw his brethren, he knew them, but made him, King James says, made himself strange unto them, and my margin says, acted as a stranger to them.
Okay.
All right, that was scheduled.
Ken.
He had been shaken by Pharaoh or by the people before he was presented to Pharaoh. So I think that he probably looked as an Egyptian.
Looked as if what?
As Egyptian as they could make him.
Oh, I'm sure he did, yeah.
His brothers probably all had long beards. And he didn't.
That may very well have been the case.